Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the fourth webinar in a series about how the new climate and climate adaptation and risk assessment tools hosted on oasishub.co and how they can help you. So your role, whether it be in insurance, consultancy, a municipality or elsewhere, involves taking informed decisions about climate risk assessment and adaptation and resilience strategies. This includes analysis of current and future hazard and risk, climate change impacts, as well as the quantification of the damage and financial losses of a flood. For many of you listening, we understand that being clear about which flood tool to use is often not an easy decision. So our webinars this autumn, you can see the previous ones on the oasishub.co blog page. Our webinars this autumn will help you understand the types of tools and data that you could consider. So by talking to the flood specialists themselves, like Fathom today, about their flood tools and their flood data, we'll show you the diversity of solutions available to you and help you decide which tools and data work best for the challenges that you are looking to address. I'll post the link to the details of our next webinar and the three you might have missed in the chat box at the end of today's discussion, as well as the link to the data set and tools we're going to be hearing about today. Dr Christopher Sampson is Chief Technical Officer at Fathom. He studied a Master's in Physical Geography at the University of Bristol before progressing to an industry-sponsored PhD under Professor Paul Bates. His PhD focused on the development of catastrophe models for flood risk for the reinsurance market. And it was through this work that the need for better flood risk analytics at the global scale was identified, ultimately leading to the formation of Fathom. Dr. Sampson now directs research and development strategy and has guided the development of Fathom's modeling framework, becoming known as a leading expert in the field of large-scale flood models. So today's webinar is aimed at helping those of you working in reinsurance and insurance, corporate risk management, conservation and disaster response. I believe Dr. Sampson's going to touch upon Fathom's global data sets, but more specifically cover the new Fathom US hazard data set. It brings together improved inland flood maps with Fathom's new coastal flooding model and includes storm surges based on over 50,000 synthetic hurricanes, which have been produced as a result of MIT research. And the comprehensive national scale flood model accounts for climate change impact with scenarios for 2020 and 2050. The new US data underpins the First Street Foundation's flood factor, which makes it possible for anyone in the US to instantly see the flood risk for their property, which is a game changer when it comes to understanding the real flood risk in the States. After his presentation, I'll explain to you how you can use the data on Oasis Hub, and then we'll answer questions, but please feel free to post them in the chat box as we go along. It looks like we've got a good mix of insurance, consultancies, government organizations here today. We're interested to know how you're planning to use the data, so do let us know in the poll that I'll set going shortly, but not before I hand over to Dr. Christopher Sampson. Good afternoon, Dr. Sampson. I don't suppose you are able to take over the presentation from me.
Okay, if you enable me to share my screen, I will try and get this working.
Are you able to do it now?
Yep, I seem to be able to do it now, so that's fine.
Okay.
So if I share this and hopefully start that. Can you now see the main presentation screen?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, great. And I'll get rid of the poll because I don't think that's probably aimed at me. Right. Thanks, Will, for the introduction. Today, I'll start by briefly introducing Fathom and explaining how we approach our modelling work mainly through a process of leading by peer-reviewed academic research before creating product. I'll then talk about our US model in particular, because that's the focus of this talk, including some of the recent improvements that we've made to it since our initial release a couple of years ago. And I'll spend a bit of time talking about the validation work we do, because that's very important to us. And a part of that is looking at how our data compares to other open data sets that you may be familiar with, such as the FEMA data. Following this, we'll take a look at some of the climate change work we've been doing, amongst other types of application. And then, as Will said, at the end, there'll be some time for questions. So Fathom was formed out of a field-leading hydrology research group at the University of Bristol. And this group was led by one of my co-founders, Professor Paul Bates, who received a CBE last year for his work. So he is one of the most important scientists in the world for this kind of thing. Now, Paul doesn't like to be reminded that his career started nearly 30 years ago now, back in the early 90s. But it was really around the year 2000 that the turning point came, because that's when he released a seminal paper describing the first grid-based flood model, upon which many of the modeling tools used by industry are based today. The company itself didn't start until about 10 years after that, around a whiteboard in his office, actually. And something that we're really quite proud of is the fact that since starting the company, our research output has actually increased. And an example of some of these papers are shown on the timeline here, starting sort of 2015, with the description of our modeling framework, and then subsequent papers on things like validation, flood defenses, catastrophe modeling, vulnerability. Now, all of our papers are available on our website. So if you take a look at fathom.global/academic papers, you can actually take a look at all of the real detail that underlies what we do. And those papers are all open source. So they're not behind a paywall, so you can get access to them very easily. So what can we do? This animation here on the screen is an example of a typical engineering flood model, if you like. So this was fairly standard state of affairs about 10 years ago, and it's the kind of tool that most engineering companies will use to do local scale flood risk assessments. And these models are really good. So this particular simulation here shows the Carlisle floods in 2005 in the UK. And the model here is produced using a lot of high quality local data. So engineers went out and measured the rivers. I've got a poll pop back up here. So the engineers went out and measured the size of the rivers. We've got very high quality terrain data. We've got long historical records of flow from the Environment Agency in the UK. And if you put all of this information into a computer model, and it's quite a laborious process to do this, but if you do it, you can build a very detailed local model that's very accurate. This particular event had a lot of observational data collected for it. So there were a lot of high watermark data collected for it. And actually the model proved to be as good as that data. So the simulation that you see here fell within the actual observed error, which basically means the model is as good as we can measure it to be. So if we're able to do that, then as researchers, there weren't an awful lot of questions left to answer for this kind of model. And the thing that interested us then was not kind of fiddling around the edges trying to make little tiny marginal gains on local scale models, but rather to answer the question, how do you build models that are useful at much larger scales, at the national scale or even the global scale, where clearly the kinds of methods and data that you use to build a local model aren't available. So that was the research question. That's what really interested us. And effectively, we laid out what we thought were the major challenges around this problem and set about solving them and publishing papers along the way. And it's this process really that led to the formation of the company and the release of both our global data and the first generation of our US data. And yeah, to cut 3 or 4 years research short, we achieved this, and in an award-winning paper in 2017, we demonstrated that the models that we built using these technologies at national scales were able to largely replicate the quality of local data. So working with the team at Google Earth Engine, we compared our national data set with the entire FEMA flood catalogue. So this was the first large-scale validation of a national-scale flood model that had been undertaken. As I say, the paper won quite a few awards because of its novelty. And what we showed in summary was that where FEMA data exists, and particularly where that data is qualified by FEMA as being high quality, so effectively a recent model, the two data sets match very, very closely. And I'd like to emphasize the point about where they exist, because the shortcomings of the FEMA dataset aren't in the quality of the data, but rather in the coverage of the data. And if we look at this in a little more detail, what you can see is that FEMA themselves state that 40% of the US is not mapped at all by flood models. And even in those areas that are mapped, you can see that about half of them are at least 10 years old. So about half of the existing US flood models that are used to map risk across the US in the FEMA data sets are at least 10 years old. So what you end up with is very patchy coverage within the FEMA catalog. And anybody who's listened to this, who has worked with this data, will be aware of this, I'm sure. And what you can see on the slide here is the FEMA data in red overlaying our data in blue. And you can see that where the FEMA data exists, they match very closely. They give a very similar answer. The major difference is that the FEMA data is really restricted to major river channels. And it misses an awful lot of risk away from those channels. So it misses a lot of risk in the headwaters and smaller channels. And it misses what in the insurance industry is known as off floodplain risk. So surface water flooding, for example. And this leads to a very significant underestimation of risk when using that data set. So if we look at exposure in the US using FEMA data relative to exposure in the US using our own data, there's about a threefold difference. And this is analysis that we undertook with the EPA itself, the Environmental Protection Agency in the US. And interestingly, if you look at the EPA's own projections of land use change and urbanization over the coming 100 years, you can see that we see a significant increase in exposure to flood over the coming century. And this is agnostic of climate change. So this is simply due to people moving into cities and cities growing. And because most of the good land effectively has already been used, we see a lot of development in riskier areas. We see this happening all the time. It's a big cause of many of the losses we saw during Hurricane Harvey, for example, and the EPA's own projections of land use change and urbanization suggest that this is just going to continue into the future. So if we're talking about the new data that's available on Oasis Hub from us for the US and what has changed in it, well, there's quite a few things that have been updated. We've improved both the surface water and the river flooding, so pluvial and fluvial flooding. And for the first time, we have comprehensively modeled coastal flooding. So we've looked at risk both from nuisance flooding due to high tides and also more significant and serious storm surge risk, largely, of course, related to hurricanes in the US. We've done a lot of work on flood defenses. I'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute, as well as looking at climate states. And this includes adaptation to the present day change, as well as to 2050. So we're not assuming that the historical record is necessarily a perfect representation of today's risk. So that's quite an interesting point. And I'll also talk about the flood factor, the first street flood factor release, which you may be aware of. So just at a high level, what are the three types of flooding? Well, we have pluvial, fluvial, and coastal, which, if you're not aware, are effectively surface water flooding from extreme rainfall. So kind of localized thunderstorm type rainfall. You have fluvial flooding, which is perhaps what you might most readily associate with flooding, which is a river effectively bursting its banks and flooding the surrounding area. And then we have coastal flooding, which is largely hurricane driven in the US from storm surges. And if I just run through these three types quickly for you. So the fluvial model considers all river channels above a catchment size of about 50 square kilometers, so down to really very small catchments. It's at 10-meter resolution nationwide. We explicitly represent all the channels within this, so that I'm not going to go into the details of the modeling kind of technology in this talk. It's, if you want those kind of details, they're all available in the papers, or you can just email us. But we do represent all river channels explicitly. It's an absolutely essential part of the flood model. You can't just sort of dump water onto an elevation model and hope that it goes in the right direction. It doesn't work. You need to have the river network represented explicitly and parameterized correctly, and all of these details. And it's a hugely important part of making a model work. It's got 100% coverage of the contiguous US. We use the USGS flow gauges themselves to characterize flow across the country. And we have 10 return periods running from the 5-year to the 1,000-year. And you can see on the imagery here a little event validation for the data set, which I think shows quite nicely. So we did some work with Planet, who are one of our partner organizations. They're a remote sensing company. And that's the surface water observations in red there on the left-hand pane of Omaha City during the Midwest floods last year, the 2019 Midwest floods. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the equivalent return period flood event out of the model. And actually, one of the nice things that you can do with this sort of data is combine the two to actually estimate the flood depths that are associated with an event in near real time. So that's an example of this here. Moving on to pluvial, it's a very similar story in terms of the resolution and the national coverage, and indeed the stream network. But of course, the difference here is that there's no minimum catchment size at all. So rain falls all over the model domain, and you can see the floodplains, the small floodplains, and the off floodplain risk hotspots that result from this sort of event. Again, we're using local US data to characterize rainfall with the return periods running from the 5 to the 1,000. And then the coastal model, similar again in terms of resolution and coverage and return periods. One of the interesting things we've done with this is explicitly represent compound flooding. So we've looked at the interaction between storm surge, coastal processes, and river floods, for example. And it's been characterized using a large hurricane event set from some colleagues at MIT in the Rhodium Group, and University of Berkeley, California. And as I mentioned, it's been updated to represent the present day hurricane risk as characterized by those models from MIT and Berkeley, as well as future risks. Now, flood defenses are a critical part of any flood model, particularly in the US, because there is such an extensive network of levees that have been built. One of the challenges associated with this is that there isn't a comprehensive data set of levees in existence. So even the US Army Corps' own data set of levees, we believe, is only about a third complete. And as you can imagine, this makes building models really quite difficult. And this example here is Sacramento in California. So it's a city that is effectively on a very high risk floodplain, and has suffered historically, particularly during the 19th century, some really truly catastrophic floods that effectively completely decimated the city. And as a result, the entire river system is levied. And you can just see from the simulations here, if you don't have those levees in place, you have a huge overestimation of risk. So having the levees within the model is important. And we've published a lot of research around this and some large-scale machine learning techniques that effectively use terrain data and some clever algorithms to look for levee-like features, so long linear features next to rivers, to try and actually tease this information out from raw terrain data rather than relying on third-party data sets to understand where these levees are and how big they are, and then build them into the model. So the climate change piece and the future simulations, as I mentioned, this is something we did collaboratively with a number of partners, because clearly climate science is a very complicated thing, and to be able to simulate flood risk in the future, you really need to have a decent understanding of climate model ensembles and how the projections that come out of those can be translated into projections of extreme rainfall and then flow and ultimately flood hazard. And so that really is a multidisciplinary piece of work, and hence why we teamed up with people from Berkeley and MIT and the Climate Impacts Group via the Rhodium Group, as well as obviously ourselves for the actual flood simulation itself. And we have produced data sets that show change both today, 2035 and 2050 at the RCP 4.5 emission scenario. So unsurprisingly, the future data is specified the same as the present day data in terms of the coverage and the resolution and the minimum and maximum return periods. And the result of this work, and I suppose this is an interesting application of our work more generally, but the result of this work was the nationwide release of Flood Factor by First Street. Now this tool is a free for public use tool that allows any American to check their flood risk at their individual property, or indeed any property they want to look at. And it includes climate change projections, FEMA data for comparison, and frames everything within the context of a 30-year mortgage term. Now, an interesting point about this project was that the aim was to make the data as relatable and understandable as possible to the general public. And so a lot of consumer testing went into the interface and how the data was framed. And that led to the idea of framing things around mortgage terms, because that was found to be something that was well understood. It was a very well understood frame of reference to the typical homeowner. And therefore, all the characteristics and statistics that are calculated within this system are displayed for the 30-year term. And the testing showed that this was a much more impactful method of displaying the information than to just use the traditional engineering approaches, such as the 1 in 100-year floodplain. The commercial applications, the flood factor data is available through a paid licensed API to allow bulk consumption for portfolio analysis. And of course, the underlying data is available via Oasis Hub. So if you want to actually look at the data itself that built this system, then that's the kind of data that you can access through Oasis Hub. So this is an example of effectively what it looks like in terms of location, the flood factor score, which is First Street's own way of effectively scoring risk from 1 to 10 to make it easier for the end user. And you can look at climate change projections and how that risk is expected to change over the coming decades. And I guess one of the more exciting parts of this is that this data has now been pushed live onto realtor.com with other large US real estate companies following, websites following. So it's trying to push this kind of information right into the hands of the US public to really raise awareness of risk and flood risk over and beyond the limited coverage that's offered by FEMA. So, there are now 7 million daily views of this data set. And the whole idea, of course, in terms of building public awareness of this issue is that it drives demand for the commercial applications of the data. And unsurprisingly, this then generated quite a bit of press coverage in the US. So we had sort of big pieces in the New York Times and Washington Post and Bloomberg and so on. So again, this is I think is a really good thing for raising awareness of this kind of data and the kind of problems that people face. across the US. And we know that they're real. We've seen events recently, be they Harvey or the Midwest floods, where huge numbers of people were affected by very severe flooding who fell outside of FEMA zones. And so weren't aware of this issue and weren't covered for this issue. So a little bit about validation, because this is where I think there's often a fairly significant gap in terms of commercial model provision and the information that's available. So it's something that we focus very, very hard on. We don't release anything unless we do a lot of validation work. That validation work goes into peer-reviewed journals so that you can take a look at it, both good and bad, because obviously these models are uncertain. Now, I'm not going to talk about everything that we've done, because obviously that would take far more than the sort of 10 minutes or so that I have left here. But one of the things I wanted to focus on as an example was the 5-year flood in the US. So in the first version of our data, we realized that one of the hardest things to simulate in a large-scale flood model like this were high-frequency events. The 1 in 5-year, the 1 in 10-year event. We knew that our old model was overly conservative, so a bit too wet for these high-frequency events. We knew that through validation work, we knew that through interaction with clients who were using it. And this happens because for these kind of marginal events where you're just getting a little bit of flooding, even a little misalignment between the estimates of channel size and the estimates of flow can throw the simulations out of kilter quite quickly. So we put an awful lot of work into how we calibrate our channel network relative to our flows, relative to the elevation model, to try and improve this coupling and process representation. And there's a paper just released that talks about this, a couple of papers actually that have just been released in the last year that talk about this. But in order to show that the improvements that we've made have actually worked, we looked at the National Floodplain Insurance Program claim rate, so the NFIP claim rate, and we found that in any given year, there was about a 20% chance of at least 1.76% of policies making a claim. So that's the 1 in 5-year claims rate. We then calculated the proportion of the US building stock that falls within our modeled 1 in 5-year floodplain and found this to be very similar at 1.7%. So we found that the 1 in 5-year claim rate and the proportion of the building stock in the 5-year floodplain are about the same in the latest version of our model. In the first version of our model, we were nearly twice this, at 3.3%. So it gives us good confidence that the model is a lot more behavioral now for these kind of high frequency events. And of course, these have a real outsized effect on your risk profile because they happen frequently. So if you're overestimating or indeed underestimating significantly at the 5-year or the 10-year level, that has a very big impact on your loss calculations. Looking more broadly at the 100-year sort of major flood event and magnitude that most people are familiar with, well, we've got very, very good scores across the board against the entire high quality FEMA catalogue. So again, we compared every single high quality flagged FEMA 100-year flood map to the same areas in our data. And we see some very high hit rates, very low false alarm ratios, and critically, the CSI scores, the critical success index scores, are around 0.8. And CSI is a very punitive measure of model performance, and a score of 0.8, it goes between 0 for no skill at all and 1 for perfection. And 0.8 is about as good as you can really expect from a typical kind of high quality flood model. It's about what we expect to see, for example, when you try and recreate a historical event using a local engineering grade model. So, we're very pleased with these national level statistics. They give us a lot of confidence that the model is indeed skillful and works across a wide range of climate types and regions, as well as, of course, both the inland and the coastal components. What's it look like? So these are just some pretty pictures basically to show you how the flood maps vary by return period. So we're looking fairly arbitrarily here at Dallas. And as we move from the 5-year to the 20-year to the 100-year, the 500-year, you can see some pretty significant differentiation between these return periods. You can see the dotted red lines here are levees, so you can see some of these levees that are not engineered to the 100-year standard failing within the model. If you look at a similar thing for pluvial, you see the 5-year, there's largely no pluvial flooding because we assumed that the drainage network within Dallas can handle a 5-year event. But as you start to exceed that, you start to see some localized flooding in the headwaters. And as we move to the 100-year and the 500-year, this clearly gets worse. And this is a major part of what's missing from the FEMA data sets and from a lot of other national scale analyses of risk. So some application examples. What can we use the data for? I imagine many people watching this have their own ideas about what they would like to use the data for, but as an example, you can clearly use it for underwriting individual assets and looking at the location risk. And clearly you can broaden that out to looking at risk across portfolios. So you can use it to screen risky assets out of portfolios in unmodeled risk areas, or you can look at risk accumulation across portfolios. You can use the data outside of the insurance market for asset management and resilience. So we have a number of clients who use it to look at key pieces of infrastructure and to understand whether there's risk today, whether there may be risk in the future, or indeed by looking at how that risk changes by return period to get an idea of what the sensitivity might be like. This is really similar to the kind of climate change resilience work. Obviously, rather than just using a static time frame, you can look at present day and future risk, and you can stress test against that, so you can see whether the location is resilient in the future, or whether you're expecting higher water surface elevations, and if so, do you need to undertake some engineering potentially, or at least undertake a local a detailed local engineering study to look at whether this might be necessary. Supply chain and network risk is an interesting one. So where you have links between assets, be they kind of road networks or data networks, communications networks. Wherever you have a physical links between locations, you can look at those relative to the hazard data in the event sets to see whether or not you have some systemic risk there. And then outside of the asset world, you've also got disaster risk management and scenario planning. So this may be local agencies or non-governmental organizations that assist with disasters. They need to have a good idea of where the risk hotspots are. And so that's a common use for our data, both in the US and globally. So just to give you an example now of an application of this data in Houston within the context of climate change. So we chose this just because we're obviously so heavily impacted by Harvey, so it's an area that some people may well be familiar with. And what we're looking at here is the 100-year floodplain, present day 100-year floodplain. And in this part of the world, the 100-year floodplain, coastal floodplain is really, we're talking about hurricanes, is driven by hurricane surge. So you can see already there's quite substantial surge risk. And this is more significant flooding than we saw during Harvey, because actually during Harvey, the surge itself was relatively modest. It was more of a rainfall event. But if we look at what that might look like in 2050, considering the impact of both sea level rise and changing hurricane behavior, we can see a fairly marked increase in that 100-year floodplain, which suggests that really there are some quite significant adaptation changes required if we're going to protect these areas as we move forward in time. So if we zoom in a little bit into the Baytown area, we can see some sort of marginal risk at the 100-year level today for this large industrial estate. But if we move out to 2050, you know, this risk has become a lot more material, and clearly this is an area that needs to be thinking about adaptation. And we can move that sort of analysis out to the national scale and look at which areas are most likely to suffer. And you know, this analysis has shown that, you know, within our model projections, it's Texas and Louisiana in particular that are likely to see the biggest increase in the percentage of properties impacted by future storm surge. So there's an awful lot of kind of new and interesting ways of interacting with the data and using it to look at how things are changing through time. One thing I wanted to mention briefly is that this data, the static hazard data, forms the kind of like the underpinnings in many ways of the catastrophe model that we built using it. This talk isn't about the CAT model, so very briefly, it's the hazard layers are used alongside a big statistical tool to generate event sets. So 566,000 events, giving us a 10,000 year event set. This is linked to an exposure and vulnerability component, which we published recently, doing a lot of work with the claims data from the NFIP catalog, and then running it through the Oasis financial engine to actually generate portfolio losses. So yeah, the hazard data itself is the partner to the CAT model, and both are powerful tools for understanding risk in different ways. And this CAT model is available through our partners, NASDAQ Exceedance Complex, and runs on Oasis LMF, so on the loss modeling framework, as well as an in-house R-based version if you would rather use it that way. So in summary, the data that's available through the Oasis Hub for the US is fluvial and coastal perils, 10 return periods running from 5 to 1,000 years for both 2020 and 2050. We have sample data available, 5 inland areas and 5 coastal areas, with documentation that is free to access and download, and it is available now. So if you're interested in taking a look at this and having a play with the data for yourselves, please do let us know, and we can supply that. Future developments. I've laboured the point, I think, that we're a research-led organisation, and so this is something that never stops. So there's a bunch of different things that we want to look at within the US, higher resolution models, particularly to capture the nuances of urban flash flooding. For that, we need even better terrain data in some areas, looking at sort of 1 meter resolution, 15 centimeter of vertical RMSE, and putting more of the anthropogenic, so human control structures into the model. Again, this is important for converging the national scale model skill with local scale models. Is to have more information about things like dam release schemes and pumps and other flow control structures. And that's something that we're doing in conjunction with the First Street team. So that project takes feedback from the public and feeds it back to us, which then allows us to update the model for future releases. So there is a feedback loop associated with that public-facing release of the data, which is quite a novel thing, and should lead to effectively public crowdsourcing of the bits of information that aren't currently available for these models. And then, of course, away from that side of things and looking at the climate change side of things, we need to continue to use the latest climate change ensembles and future population data, GDP projections, to give a broader range of scenarios for end users to look at. So yeah, if you'd like to get in touch with us, please email us or take a look at our website. We also have a blog series on the website, fathom.global/insights, which we update pretty frequently with different ideas and thoughts and videos and what have you. So you can see what we're up to on that. But yeah, I think I'll leave it at this point and open it up for any questions, unless Will wants to say anything else quickly.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dr. Sampson. We've already had some excellent questions come in, but first I want to quickly explain how folks can get the data from Oasis Hub. So both version 2 updates of the Fathom datasets are available on the Oasis Hub. Pricing of the data is conditional on your requirements as a customer, depending on needed return periods, flood types, and spatial extents. As standard, both the global and the US models come with the displayed return periods on the slide for each flood type. There are 3 models of pricing for both models. For global version 2, the pricing can be broken down by global coverage per country and by square kilometre, which is suitable for site-specific or regional spatial extents. And then for the US model, the geographical breakdown for pricing is whole country for the contiguous US, per state, and by square kilometre. So this provides you with some flexibility to suit your needs, and if necessary, we're able to process and cut the data to your specific requirements as well. It comes in GeoTIFF raster format, and the flood depth units are in centimetres for the US at 10-metre resolution, in metres for global at 90-metre resolution. To get a quotation, if you land on any of the Fathom dataset listings on the hub and click Get Price, just fill in the form detailing your required license term, the spatial extents, the return periods, and the flood types. And once we receive it, we'll get back to you with a quotation. And if you've got any questions about that, please do let me or any of my colleagues know on the following email address. So I'll move to questions. We have had 3 or 4 come in so far. I don't know whether one of the questions has already been answered, whether Fathom has coverage internationally, for example, within Africa. That came from Peter. Like, is the global data suitable for what Peter is after? Sampson?
So, well, I mean, I don't know exactly what he wants to do with it, but yes, we have complete global coverage with the data. So it's not to the same specification as the US data, and that's because the input data to the models is not as good globally as it is in the US. So that's why the resolution is a little bit coarser at 90 meters. The return period projection is the same, 5 to 2000. But it's probably the core data set actually for what we do. So obviously this talk is focused on the US data, but we started by building a global flood model. We've just updated it with a second release that uses an updated digital elevation model, so Merit DEM, which is something we've had a lot to do with the development of, as well as a whole bunch of other improvements. And this data is used by a lot of people. So it's used by insurers, it's used by the World Bank, and yeah, it has coverage everywhere. So depending on what you want to do with it, of course, it may well be applicable.
Great, thanks. Ariadna asks, do the model US forecasting of climate change impacts on, do the models US flooding, sorry, let me try that again. Do the models US forecasting of climate change impacts on flood hazard maps? If so, how are the parameters chosen, as this is hazard focused? Can we imagine to add on vulnerability indicators in such mapping exercises?
Yeah, so I mean, again, this is I guess this came in a little bit earlier in the talk, so I imagine we've sort of answered this already. We obviously have done the climate change modelling out to 2035 and 2050 for RCP 4.5. The reason that those scenarios were chosen was really largely dictated by the First Street project and their goals. We will be broadening those sort of both the time horizons and the scenario selection through time to give a broader range of views. I mean, clearly this is a moving target because the climate science itself continues to evolve. So we're getting new climate ensembles, you get updated pathways, emission scenarios, etc. So we will continue to evolve our view of flood risk in conjunction with and in parallel with the climate modeling community. And then if we want to look at vulnerability indicators, absolutely you can do. So if you take a look at our website, you'll see that we very recently released a paper on vulnerability. That vulnerability information is built into the catastrophe model. So if you run your information, your locations through the catastrophe model, the vulnerability code within that will effectively expose your assets to the correct vulnerability functions. They're probabilistic. They're based on the entire NFIP database for different property types and occupancy types and so on. But you can also potentially do it statically if you wanted to. So yeah, you can. And there's an awful lot of work that's starting to be done with this to look at sort of distributed risk and things like that through space. So there's a huge amount of work being done by economists, for example, starting to look at not just the raw hazard, but actually how that hazard translates into downstream impacts of different types. So yeah.
Thank you. We've got a couple more questions that have come in. Just to remind people, if you've got any questions about today's talk, just type them in the Q&A box or in the chat box, and they'll get passed to me. Dr. Singh from CTRAN in India has asked whether it takes into account urban flooding arising out of one-day maximum participation events.
One-day maximum precipitation events, I imagine. Yes, yeah. So for the pluvial model, we look at 1 hour, 6 hour, and 24-hour precipitation totals. So one of the challenges with a surface water model, a pluvial model, is that you get different types of relationships between intense rainfall and which durations of intense rainfall actually drive flooding in different parts of the world. So in semi-arid areas, for example, it's often very short duration, high intensity rainfall that drives sort of flash flood risk. Whereas in other parts of the country, it may be sort of 6 hour or 24-hour rainfall events that are actually the ones that tend to drive that sort of localized flood risk. And so the approach we take is to model all of these and actually look at, for a given location, which of them is the most likely to cause flooding. And then that's effectively the suite of simulations that find their way into the final data sets. So hopefully that answers that question.
Thomas Langen has asked a question sort of develop. I assume it's based on what you were talking about levees. Based on that before, yes. Do the pluvial or fluvial models include hydraulic structures such as bridges or culverts? And additionally, what does the pluvial model include urban stormwater infrastructure? There's another bit which, what coastal model is being used to compute coastal storm surge risk, slosh, ADCI, RC, etc.
Yeah, okay, fine. So, okay, to the first question. So localized engineering structures are a challenge because when you're building a national scale model, that kind of information generally isn't available. So it's one of the big kind of important parts of the First Street project is to try and crowdsource more of that kind of information. So we've done an awful lot of work already with effectively a data gathering team, particularly around coastal areas and looking at sort of pumping stations in Florida, for example. And obviously I talk to levees. So we do an awful lot of work around levee structures, both with the National Levee Database, which is obviously the information that is available. Although, as I said, it's probably only about a third of the levees that are in it, and a lot of the levees that are in it don't have an awful lot of characterizing information. So we're actually working directly with FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers to try and improve that database, as well as looking at the raw high quality elevation data itself and using machine learning algorithms to extract levee features from that. Stormwater is particularly challenging, as are kind of things like dam control systems, because for stormwater, you generally don't have openly available information about the details of a stormwater network. So you have to make assumptions about what the drainage capacity of a particular city is likely to be. Is it approximately 10 years? Is it approximately 20 years? And we can go some way with that by talking to local cities. But obviously some of that information is more forthcoming than others. When you start to look at dams, it's particularly difficult, of course, because there is the national security component to dam operation. So generally speaking, you just have to infer what you can from the upstream and downstream flow records. And we're sponsoring a PhD student who's doing a lot of work on that. It's a PhD student within the group who's doing a lot of work on that, to look at generalizing the impacts of dams of different sizes on flow regimes, for example. So that's the kind of control structure type question. Hopefully, we do what we can, and it's an ongoing process, as you can imagine. In terms of the coastal modelling, so we didn't do the actual kind of run up modelling ourselves. So that was done by the Rhodium group. They used a tool called GeoClaw, which is a variable mesh grid that allows effectively very rapid computation for the kind of large number of hurricane tracks that we had to simulate. It was obviously validated and benchmarked against ADCIRC to sort of show that it had skill. So we've just had accepted in water resources research as of a few days ago, the major methodology paper that outlines all the changes that we've made to the model since the 2017 paper that we published. So that goes into detail of the methods. So that's just in sort of final sort of minor revisions at the moment. So it should be, if it's not already, actually, it should be available in sort of a pre-release to take a look at. So you can look at the details of the methodology in there, or if you want to, please just email us and we can talk about the details. It's not actually my area, the storm surge, but it's one of my colleagues can probably answer anything that you need to ask.
Thank you. I think we've got 2 remaining questions, unless anyone else has any further questions. I think the first one I'll go is from Ricardo Tavares da Costa, who asks what data sets you're using for weather forcings in the case of pluvial and surge, and if you have flexibility to specify a different data set.
Yeah, so for pluvial, as I said, it's the NOAA IDF relationships, so the US intensity, duration, frequency relationships across the US. Globally, we have collected as many different IDF relationships as we possibly can. So the idea between that, or behind that, as I said, is to try and characterize for each return period the 1 hour, the 6 hour, and the 24-hour rainfall for a given return period, and then use those to drive the models. For the water levels, we use the kind of NOAA tide gauge records for the non-hurricane extreme water levels, and then the hurricane data came from Kerry Emanuel's group at MIT with the Climate Impacts Lab and Rhodium effectively running computing the water levels using GeoClaw from those, and then those are effectively brought into a statistical framework that combines them with the standard sort of high water levels to give us the return period water levels that form the boundary conditions for the hydraulic model. So it's fairly complex, trying to disentangle stochastic hurricane tracks from kind of historical tide levels, as well as obviously sea level rise. So there's a statistical framework that kind of ties all that together. That's talked about in the paper that I just mentioned, and brings it all together to get the coastal boundaries.
Thanks. We've got one final question. Paul Hudson asks what FEMA's response.
Yeah, I've seen that. That's an interesting question.
I'll just read it out. If it indicates the flood zones should be larger, this would imply a wider extension of compulsory insurance purchase, which combined with the ad hoc movement to fully risk-based premiums, it could create a bit of a difficult situation given the different political incentives the NFIP faces.
Yeah, so I mean, the NFIP and FEMA, one of the things obviously they're heavily constrained by are local and regional politics, and there are many examples of of flood zones being drawn or redrawn or not drawn as a result of this. FEMA's actually been very welcoming to the project. That's probably in part because we've done a fair bit of work with them. We made sure that they were aware that this work was ongoing. And we use FEMA models, as I said in this talk, to validate our models. So this is not seen as a challenge to the FEMA data set. It's not looking to undermine the FEMA data set. Where those FEMA models exist and where they've been made recently. So, within the last 10 years or so, using LiDAR data and proper hydraulic models, they're very good. And hence why we use them to benchmark our own techniques and our own models. It's just that they don't exist everywhere. I mean, FEMA has spent billions trying to map the US, and the coverage is, as we know, very limited still. So this is very much a complementary data set, and that's how FEMA have welcomed it. That's a really good thing, because the whole idea is to improve public knowledge and public awareness of this issue, and to empower the public to make better decisions about managing their own risk.
We have one final question from Robin. How much of a difference do you expect to see by improving the resolution from 3 meters to 1 meter?
Sure. So we're not talking there about improving or increasing the hydraulic simulation resolution, because to do hydraulic simulations at 1 meters, indeed even at 3 meters for very large scales, would still be kind of computationally intractable, even for kind of most supercomputing clusters to solve the shallow water equations properly. What you can do is get improved vertical precision in the underlying elevation model that you can intersect with a slightly more coarsely simulated water surface. And for fine scale urban simulations, that can help, because you can sort of pick out more clearly potentially base flood elevations and things like that for buildings, and what the actual sort of threshold height may be. So yeah, it's more around getting access to high quality terrain data from which to derive or better derive sort of street level elevations and things like that, which are then slightly coarsened to go into the model. But more than the horizontal resolution, it's the vertical precision that's key. So it's that 15, rather than 3 meters to 1 meter horizontal, the bit to be focusing on really is the 15 centimeter vertical precision, because that's the thing that drives this. Flood surfaces are pretty flat. Flood water is pretty flat. It doesn't vary very much from 1 meter to the next, because anywhere that's steeply sloping doesn't tend to have deep floods. And so, it's that vertical precision that's important.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Sampson. It's been a really interesting presentation, and something that I hope everyone attending can benefit from. Oasis Hub are here to help everyone attending to find the type of tool that they need. If you're interested in the dataset and tools we've talked about today, or any other tools that you find on Oasis Hub, please do email us hello@oasishub.co, and we'll be in touch. I've posted a link to the data and tools and our email address and the future and previous webinars in the chat, the Zoom webinar chat. So the next webinar is going to be in a fortnight on Monday, the 16th of November. We're going to be joined by JBA Director Jane Toothill and JBA Climate Risk Consultant Sarah Jones to discuss their data suite, which comprises a full range of RCP scenarios and represents 5-year time periods from now until the end of the century, and talk about how this can be complemented by their UK climate change flood model and flood modelling on a global scale. So once again, thank you to Fathom for joining us this week. Please join us again in a fortnight's time to learn more about how the different flooding data we host can help you.